So a lot of people ask me questions about where I would place certain decks, in regards to the metagame. What do I think about this deck? What do I think about that deck? And it's been a long time since I made a standard metagames kind of deck tier list. And I figured, why not do it for this meta? Because this is actually a very interesting metagame with a lot of decks that are viable. And that's something that we don't always see in standard. So that's definitely a good thing for variety's sake, specifically on Arena. And as long as you're playing any deck above tier 2, I would say, you're doing something right and you're going to be winning most of your games. Because most of the tier 2 decks in this meta are really good in certain matchups. And definitely have a generalist strategy that is very solid compared to everything else. Everything just feels kind of like it's on the same level, which is really nice. So what I'm going to be working with today is, we're going to be working with S, A, B, C, D, F tiers, but the equivalent is going to be, for standard, like when we talk about decks in general, usually people say tier 1, tier 2, and tier 3. I'm going to be splitting that up a little bit. So tier 1 will just be S tier. Tier 2 will be A and B. So this will be high tier 2, low tier 2. And then tier 3, high tier 3, low tier 3, and then F tier, we're probably putting nothing in there because realistically, I'm only rating decks that are pretty good. I'm mostly interested about talking about those. None of these decks will be going into basically trash tier, aka meme tier F. But maybe some in high tier 3. I don't know. We'll find out. So let's get started. And I think the first deck I want to put in the tier list is going to be the definition of middle of the road, I think, in terms of power. And that is going to be Rakdos Discover. So I'm just going to be slapping Rakdos Discover in, low tier 2. I think the deck is really awkward to play. It's like it's still good. It has good elements. Like the Discover mechanic is powerful. But without blue, you can have some trouble against the combo decks that are just going to kill you outright. You do not have that much board presence to present early on. So your aggressive game plan is not that effective either. You have, awkward sweepers. Like they're good, but they're not like super good against decks like Boros, for example. You don't have much life gain either. So you're kind of in a weird spot where it's just mediocre. I would say it's mediocre. But mediocre in this meta means that it's still pretty good. So it's kind of like, it's definitely something that you can play. And if you enjoy that strategy, you probably should play it because it's a fun deck. But don't expect to be, winning as much as some of the other decks because this deck has its clear weaknesses and clear ways that you can attack it to kind of take advantage of those weaknesses. Because I think a deck that would be just straight up better is going to be a deck I'm going to cover in a second here. But essentially lacking the color for counter magic, I think, is a huge downside. And directly tied to that, I'm just going to place Dimir Tempo, which I think is actually pretty good. I think Dimir is going to be... Actually, I should say, I'll say Dimir is like... I'll put it here for now, but it's going to be mid tier 2. So this is like low tier 2, I would say. This is mid tier 2 because the blue gives you access to counter magic, which is really good in this meta with all the combo decks running around, with all the control decks, with all the... there's ramp, there's other mid-range decks, and even against aggro in general, counter magic is still pretty good. So having access to blue gives you a very big advantage, I think, overall in this meta. And that's the color that's going to be placed more so towards the top. If you have blue, you're probably in a better position than some decks that don't have blue, that don't have like a very clear game plan. So I'm going to be putting Dimir for now over here hanging out, like not super high tier 2, like pretty much middle of the road. So I'm probably like bottom of this tier, bottom of A. I'm going to be placing that there. I guess I'll place one of the decks that I think is actually pretty weak. It's a deck that I really like. Unfortunately, I tried to make it work. I really did. But it's kind of comparable to both of these that are already on the tier list because it has black as like, your removal spell, your like chunky creatures, like really solid value creatures. Black has a lot to offer. But green is just simply not very effective in this metagame if you're just going to pair it with black. This will definitely go like, mid tier 3, like it's, or high tier 3, like C tier, I think it's definitely going to stick in C tier. I don't know if it's going to be at the top or not. Maybe there'll be another deck in C tier that'll take over. But for now, we're just going to place it in C tier because I think it's just too dirtily. Like it's a deck that has a lot of value, barely any disruption. Its creature game plan is solid, but it just doesn't have the aggressiveness. It doesn't have like it can't put a clock on your opponent. It doesn't have like great sweepers, kind of like the same problem with Rakdos, where, you know, Path of Peril is your best sweeper. It's fine, but it won't really be able to stabilize you all the time against, you know, the Rakdos, not the Rakdos decks, the Boros decks. And if you're playing a deck like specifically green-black, one of the reasons why it's weaker than potentially Rakdos Discover is also because if you do decide to play cards like Path of Peril in your main deck, which does give you the highest chance possible at beating decks like Boros, then you're going to be stuck with those in your hand in matchups where it's useless. And that is not the case for a deck like Rakdos, because they have access to some looting in whatever form that takes. Usually it's just going to be Harvester, the blood token, giving you access to, you know, a little bit more card selection. There's also the Manland that allows you to discard a card and draw a card. So you have more consistent ways to cycle through your deck in Rakdos compared to in green-black, where you're just going to hold on to that sweeper. So that means you can only have access to sweepers for the most part at max effectiveness in your sideboard. And that really creates a game plan that is just too fragile. It's not solid enough to combat, you know, the combo decks that you don't have blue, and to combat the aggro decks, because, well, the sweeper's fine, but you have to put it in your sideboard most of the time. And if you don't, then you're going to be suffering even harder against the other matchups where the sweeper doesn't work. So yeah, it's a deck that is just simply mediocre, like very, very mediocre. This is, in fact, you can even say the deck is like, this is like borderline 50% win rate, I would say. Like pretty much the definition of 50%. This might be like a little bit higher. So I guess this should be like the definition of mediocre, but compared to all the other decks I'm ranking, it is definitely on the low end for sure, or the lowest. We'll see. And you know what? Let's just place another deck that doesn't have blue. And that's going to be Boros. I might as well just get it out the way. Boros is kind of insane. It's not at the top of S tier in my opinion. It's definitely a deck that is just way too oppressive. Like, it is so good at shutting down your opponent super quickly. By turn 3, you can deal absurd amount of damage or have a lot of cards in hand with a huge board state by using the Knight Errant. You have a lot of haste. You have a lot of tricky creatures to deal with. Like the Warden is really freaking annoying sometimes against Flying and Vigilance, so you can't really block it in a traditional deck. Like Rakdos Discover has no flyers, for example. A lot of decks right now don't have access to good flying blockers, and that makes all the flying nonsense that much more powerful. They also have very good removal in the Case that also doubles up as a pseudo Anthem effect that buffs the power. So they just have answers to pretty much, I mean, their deck has insane tempo and has the answers for blockers. Like, it just kind of has everything. It's, in a perfect world, it will be winning so much. Like, the win percentage, if you draw really well with Demolition, I think that's what it's called. Gleeful? Yeah, Gleeful Demolition. The one that makes the 3/1 ones. If you draw that in your opening hand, you manage to set it up, and you manage to follow up, the game is in a really good spot for you. So the only thing that can put a wrench in that plan is, you know, play draw and potentially you not having Cavern of Souls to react to counter magic. So there's still some nuance there where counterspell decks can hit specifically at the right time, where you play the Knight and then maybe stabilize with the sweeper afterwards. But, you know, the explosiveness, the speed, it's got pretty much everything. It goes wide. It has inevitability. It's just a very good deck. And definitely sits at the top. It kind of runs over combo decks if they can't, you know, sweep you or stay, or like try to slow down the game. It's very hard to slow down a Boros deck. You have to hit the right cards at the right time. And putting your opponent on that much of a back foot is something that is just clearly a dominant strategy right now. It's just so powerful to put your opponent on the back foot early, to the extent that Boros does it. So definitely S tier for now. We'll leave it like over here. I don't know if it's going to be second best or third. We'll see about that. So the next deck I'm going to place is a deck that I played recently. And after playing it some more, I have a better idea of where I would want to place it. And you can also double this slot up to encompass the general Azorius mid-game, not mid-game, mid-range game plan. So just the Wedding Announcement, Virtue, Wandering Emperor, sweep, like some sweepers, maybe some counter magic, Denic maybe. That kind of game plan I think is equivalent to the aggressive kind of, convoke, maze game plan. And I think the deck is just, unfortunately, kind of stuck in a weird middle where it is between Boros that can put more pressure on the opponents than the Azorius aggro deck can. So it's not very high tempo compared to Boros, and it's not slow enough. It doesn't have the value to be able to grind out games. So that middle ground is a very dangerous place to be in this meta, because decks are either too explosive like Boros that will just kill you, or they're going to be playing a combo that can end the game, sometimes on turn 4, as we'll see in a second here with a deck over here. But essentially, you either close out the game early, or you have enough grinding power to stay in the game long enough to close out the game. And the go wide strategy is simply not that good. And the only way for the Azorius aggro deck, I'm going to speak specifically about the aggro deck, to win is to find a counter spell and flip the Convoke Saga, so have like an insane amount of tempo with counter magic. That's the only reason it could be better than Boros in some situations, is because you can counter the sweepers. So if you manage to perfectly pull out all the cards that you need, you curve out, you flip the battle, and then you have counterspell up. That is a very good spot. But that position is not that consistent, because your opponents have answers, right? So they're going to have some form of removal maybe early. They might not allow you to flip the battle on turn 3. You might not have the counterspell. Like, a lot of things need to line up for you to, exert an amount of pressure that is dangerous for most decks. Otherwise, they'll just, kind of chill out. There's not that much damage in the deck if you just take out like Bunny Corn and stuff like that. So most decks do not have are not as scared of Azorius aggro as they are Boros. And it's unfortunately going to be placed, bottom of tier 2, not probably better. It's a tough one. I think it's a tough one between Rakdos and Azorius aggro, just because of blue, right? I value blue more, and I think just for that reason alone, I'm going to be putting above, but they are very close, I think, in power level. I don't know. I would still put the blue deck above the red black deck, but it's pretty close in power level overall. But yeah, this would be like high bottom tier 2, so like B tier. I don't know. I keep talking in tiers, but the tier 2 stuff. All right, since I mentioned it, I might as well place it. Conspiracy Combo is a deck that uses, looting effect to try to infinitely mill you on turn 4, and then you untap and you lose the game. So the game plan is simple. You just use Reenact the Crime, try to get Breach the Multiverse. Sometimes Attrax is enough against aggro decks, but the goal is to get Breach the Multiverse and then get the Unraveler down, and then use the evidence in your graveyard to recast another Breach, and then keep cycling through that infinitely by getting the Breach back from the graveyard with, there's a 4-drop that can get it back from the graveyard. I don't remember what it is, but I don't remember the name. But that card, basically you infinite loop Breach, essentially. And it is relatively consistent at that. The only problem is that it's a deck that kind of struggles against counter magic. It's a deck that kind of struggles against graveyard hate. So there are many ways to attack this deck. It has extremely low tempo. So it's basically just relying on, casting that big spell on turn 4. If you manage to disrupt that, they're not putting any pressure on you early game. If you manage to disrupt that, you're just kind of chilling. They don't really have answers for much of anything. Whether you go wide, whether you try to go tall, they have some removal spells, I think, but if you just play a threat, that threat's going to stick around, and if you manage to stop them from going off, you can just win the game by yourself. It could be like a Preacher, it could be like a Shield Red, it could be just your general aggro deck game plan, it could be like a go wide strat and Azorius aggro. Like, there are so many ways to attack the strategy because they're relying on a specific combination of cards that it is pretty rough sometimes. And some of their setup cards are creatures, so it also enables your removal in the main deck to hit their creatures to prevent them from potentially looting. Tidebinder is a very good answer for the artifacts that can loot. So many cards are just incidentally good against this deck. It definitely lowers the value in the Conspiracy Combo deck, and that might be why you don't see as much. But I will mention that all combo decks have some value because of their kind of X factor. The fact that you can win so fast is definitely a positive, and there's really no amount of cards that will consistently, like people will not consistently have an answer to what you're doing every time. It's just impossible. So sometimes you'll get it off. The question is, are you going to get it off, 2 or more times in a best of 3 match? If your opponent's prepared, the answer is probably no. So I would definitely put Conspiracy combo probably bottom of tier 2. I don't value decks that have low consistency. And I think this is definitely one of those decks where the game plan is just a little bit too fragile, even though it is quite powerful when it does resolve. So it's kind of like a deck where, you play it if you like it, but you can't expect to win a lot of games consistently against decks that are prepared. That's all I'll say about that. Now, next on the list, I'm going to be placing Mono Blue. I don't know, I just felt like placing it. I think Mono Blue is not great. It's fine. It's always a deck that is comfortably good, I think. Like, it's a deck that is cheap. It's a deck that is effective, but it has very, very clear weaknesses. And the reason it's just not as good as before is because Mono Blue is not a deck that does very well against aggro decks. It just simply is not good. And we're talking about specifically Boros Convoke. So Mono Blue relies on countering specific spells to stop your opponent from developing, but Boros is casting so many spells early game. They can get it. Like, if you consider play draw, if you're ever on the draw as Mono Blue against a Boros deck, the amount of creatures they will be sending out early before you can even counter anything, before you can even play anything, is just way too overwhelming, and you will never be able to recover. There's no way in Mono Blue to recover the lost board. I mean, there are some, but they're very awkward. Like, there's some mass bounce spells. You can use that, but it's definitely not as effective as sweeping. And now that most decks are also playing removal in the main deck, so whether that be a deck like Mono Red, whether that be Boros, they're playing the case now. So it's not like they won't even have any answers for the Djinn once you play it. Now they actually will have an answer for the Djinn, so you also have to protect your Djinn. You're always on the back foot. So because aggro decks are so strong, this definitely makes Mono Blue a lot weaker. Another aspect that makes Mono Blue weaker is that with all the combo decks, with all the decks that are using the graveyard, so the rise in graveyard synergy decks means the rise of graveyard decks, graveyard hate, and specifically the rise of Hearse really, really hurts Mono Blue's damage output with the Djinn, and potential recurring cards as well. I don't even know if they are actually playing cards that flashback or whatever, or use the graveyard in some way. Maybe that's not even relevant, but just the damage output of the Djinn is so much lower. If somebody resolves a Hearse on turn 2, your clock is just not fast enough most of the time to compete with that, since the Hearse will become so big that it can just swing for giga damage at some point. So a lot of factors, the rise of good removal in aggro decks, the rise of aggro decks in general, and incidental graveyard hate. A lot of people running a lot of spot removal spells that are really good right now. Just hits Mono Blue really hard and makes it so that you have to line up in extremely inconsistent situation, I think, for you to be in a winning position on average. Everything has to line up extremely well. But Mono Blue's main strength is that if it finds an opening, it can capitalize on that opening extremely well if you have the right cards. So it's still a deck with merit. It's still a strong deck. It's cheap. Definitely craft it if you don't have many wild cards, and if you like the playstyle, of course. But I would not put much value on Mono Blue. But it's definitely, again, as I mentioned, anything in tier 2, which is going to be A and B tier, I think it's worth playing. But I'm definitely going to value Mono Blue at around, bottom of tier 2, probably. It might be the worst in tier 2. I don't know. We'll see. All right, next up, while we're speaking of Mono Blue, while we're speaking of Djinn, Djinn is in Blue-White Reanimate. It's a deck that uses Djinn and Monastery Mentor with the 1-mana Reanimate spell to bring it back from the graveyard and try to overwhelm your opponent with, counter magic, bounce spells, protection spells, self-mill spells, a lot of very synergistic things that can absolutely annihilate any deck if you line up the right cards. So it's basically a better version of Mono Blue in my opinion, because Monastery Mentor is a card that will just simply end the game in like 2 turns. In the right situation, you let Monastery Mentor stick on the board. If you have a sweeper and it resolves, that's fine, but usually it won't. In the case of this deck, because they have counter magic, I mean, hopefully for them, they have the counter spell. Okay, but if they do line up the counter spell, you are just screwed. You are just dead on the spot. And comparing it specifically to Azorius aggro, that's one of the reasons why I think this deck is probably better than Azorius aggro, because its game plan is more explosive in the right scenario, and it has more resiliency. Like it's trying to bring back, you know, the specific all-in-one win cons like the Jhin and like the Monastery Mentor, whereas the go wide Azorius aggro, like the Azorius midrange, is just not really doing much that pressures your life total with a single unit that can just end the game instantly, basically. And I think that's a huge benefit to playing a Monastery Mentor deck. If you manage to protect it, you're going to be in a position where your opponent will just not be able to survive in most situations. So there's definitely value there. It does have its weaknesses. It is, you know, relying on the graveyard. As I mentioned, graveyard hate is rising. It's definitely not great. You don't have that many counter spells, I think. So again, you could run into sweeper, and most sweepers are exiling actually, because, well, you know, Sunfall. Lockdown doesn't work, which is nice. That's one of the benefits of playing something like this. It does still kind of work because you can exile the tokens, but it's not going to win you the game. But you get hit by Sunfall, you're in trouble. But yeah, again, the resiliency is a huge factor, is that they can remove your stuff and you can get it back. And most removal is not actually, the most single target removal is not actually exile. So unlike this deck where they kill your bunny corn and then you have no board presence basically, and then maybe they lock down on 3 and you have nothing left, this deck, your threats are 3 mana. And that dodges Path of Peril and Lockdown. So you're already clear in that. It's already a strategy that is kind of dodging what others are doing naturally. That is definitely a huge bonus for this deck. Now, I have not played this deck, so maybe I could be wrong, but every time I play against it, I played against it as blue-white, so it was a little bit easier because I have Exile, I have Graveyard Hate, I have Sweepers. But I think this deck is quite good. Again, without playing it, this is just speculation. I will be placing this at the top of B tier, I think. Alright, next up, let's talk about a deck that has seed play recently and has gotten tournament results, very good tournament results. It's going to be Sultai Reclamation, so a deck with Slogurk, a deck with more than 60 cards, using the fetch lands, using channel lands, using Reclamation, using the 2 mana self-mill / sacrifice for ramp spell that gets the card, it gets all the lands out your graveyard onto the field. So essentially this deck is all about putting lands in your graveyard, leveraging them through, you know, the ramp spells, and potentially leveraging them through Slogurk, you know, getting them back, getting the channel lands back, and just permanently cycling that. Card advantage is fantastic in this deck. Tempo is pretty low. That is its main weakness, is that it's not really a fast deck. It can with Slogurk. You can always kind of go fast with Slogurk, but it is at the end of the day just a singular creature. And then it faces similar problems, I think, to, well, other decks that are using the graveyard, because this is definitely a deck where you're incentivized to play Graveyard Hate, and it seems like that's the case for most decks in Standard, so people are ready with their Graveyard Hate, and that is pretty annoying for a deck like this. But it has blue. That's very good. If you have blue, you're in a position where you can play some counter spells. You can play some good card draw like Deluge that is able to be self-milled as well, so you can use it later on. And it's just a deck with a lot of explosive power, and it's doing a lot of things that are, I would consider, pretty broken in a way, like Slogurk getting all the channel lands back, the channel land Takenuma that can get back your other, you know, creatures or planeswalkers. There's a lot of very synergistic things that are very effective, and that gives the deck a lot of resiliency. But it still falls into another trap as well, is that I think against aggro decks, most of these decks that I'm seeing that are kind of more combo oriented, in their main deck, they don't have access to that many sweepers. Now, that could change if they start playing sweepers, but usually those sweepers are also going to hit their own cheap creatures, specifically the ramp creature, the 1/3. And haven't seen in the list that I've seen, there aren't that many sweepers in the main deck. So you can easily just get run over by Boros Convoke. You lose game 1, and then Boros is in a good spot because they're on the play game 3. So personally, I would say that these ramp decks, while they can stabilize with a sweeper, they still have to find it, and they don't have that many, at least not in the main deck. So they can easily get run over by a deck like Boros Convoke, and they're still pretty vulnerable to cards like control decks, I would say. Well, maybe not actually. And overall, I would just say it's a pretty fragile strategy. It is resilient, but it's relying on a lot of combination of different cards, but usually synergy with just lands in general. I don't know. I'm not a huge fan of the deck. I think it's good. But I don't think it's at the top. But it is definitely in the upper half of tier 2, so it's definitely going in A tier. I think it is weaker, though, than the next deck I'm going to cover in a second here. You probably guess what that is. So I would place this like high mid tier 2, so like bottom of A probably. Definitely better than Dimir Tempo, I think. Pretty close, actually. Actually, pretty close. They both have their pros and cons. Dimir Tempo will be a deck that is much more consistently good against decks that want to be, or that you want to disrupt. But this deck will be more consistently good against like going super deep into the game, right? Like going like super long. So against control, maybe you'd want Sultai, right? I think they're about equivalent. The thing is, they have their good matchups, and their good matchups are kind of equivalent, I think. So in a way, even though they're approaching it differently, this one wants to like kind of grind you out. This one wants to like take advantage of tempo situations, like pressure you with counter magic and like flying and like card advantage stuff. It's kind of similar in a way. The strategies are different, but yeah. Anyways, let's move right on to Temur World Soul, which I think is just probably a more effective deck than Sultai Rec. And the reason for that is just because World Soul is a very good card. It's a very good card because it acts as direct damage. So World Soul, you pay X and the base cost of 2, and you deal X damage to anything. The keyword is anything there. And you also get to ramp for that amount. So you get to grab cards from your graveyard or your hand, grab lands from your graveyard or your hand and play them. So it's effectively the same kind of strategy in a way, just a different direction to Sultai Rec. And the World Soul is just too good of a card, I think. And the comparison point between this deck and the Sultai Rec is mostly that specific card. And it just works out so well, specifically with the Green Virtue that triples the amount of mana generated by basic lands. And that means that you can relatively easily, in the late game, when you have a lot of lands, you can just kill your opponent, even if you have to play the Virtue on that turn. Let's say, I don't know, at some point you'll have like so many, I don't even know how many lands you'd have on average. I actually don't know what amount you would need exactly to have lethal immediately, but probably something like 15 lands or something, 14 lands, which is relatively easy when you're in the mid to late game. So it can definitely happen against decks where you can take it slow. You can just win in a single turn, and that's what's so strong. You can play the Virtue, triple up everything, and then deal 20. Actually, I think that would just take 7. It would take like 8 extra lands, right? So, or X equal 8. No, X equal, well, you need 8 lands, so 8 times 3, 24. So you'd probably need, it would be 15 lands, which is definitely achievable in this deck against slow decks. You can definitely get there. Slam. You can double up with the Galvanic Iteration. And in other situations where you know your opponent might not have an answer, you can try slamming the Virtue on turn 7, or not on turn 7, on 7 lands. You untap, it's just lethal immediately. Like it's just, it gets kind of ridiculous. And that's why this deck is so good. And as I mentioned before, you can use this as just a ramp spell in general. You can use it as removal. The key thing it removes is going to be, cards like the Bat, for example. Very good against the Bat. Very good against a lot of like pretty weak creatures. If you manage to just ping anything for like 3 mana and ramp for 1, that's already good value, I think, for this card. So the fact that it's so flexible and so mana efficient and can be used in so many different situations just means that it's just a more consistent game plan, I think, than something like Sultai Rec, where the answers that you have are just more efficient. Specifically, another card that I should mention is because you have red, you have access to the sweeper that draws cards as well. I actually don't remember the name off the top of my head, but you pay 4 mana, you draw 2, and you can discard 2 to deal the damage equal to the highest amount of CMC that you discarded. So if you discard Virtue, you can deal 7 AoE, and if you discard, 4, like a Deluge, you do 4. You can discard like a creature for like 2 damage sweeper, but you don't have to discard, so it can also act as a card draw spell. So that's another huge benefit to being in red over black, right? So there are definitely enough benefits, and the benefits are very effective in a specific metagame, I think. Direct damage is good because it doesn't require you to, dodge any removal spell, like any answer. Like it's very difficult for them to have an answer. They would have to have specifically counter spell, and again, you can play around that by just having more mana than your opponent, because most counter magic in the main deck is tax based, like tax for 3, and when you have that much mana, it's just super easy to play around. You have galvanic iteration that can double up. You have Chandra that can double up. Like there's just so many ways to get around counter magic, and that's the only way to interact with this deck basically once it's set up. Now, it still has its weakness. Graveyard hate, as I mentioned, is a huge problem. As long as they take your lands out of your graveyard, you can't ramp, so it's definitely problematic. Another problem is it's still not that good against aggro. Again, like most aggro decks are pretty resilient to a singular sweeper. And having a sweeper on turn 4 is usually too late. So one small advantage that or not small, it's actually a pretty big advantage. One pretty big advantage that the black deck has is that it can play Path of Peril, which is just straight up better than any damage-based sweeper that you'll be able to find in red. And specifically in this deck, it's very difficult to actually cast a card like Brotherhood's End because you're not going to have the 2 red on turn 3, so you have to play a 2 damage sweeper, basically. And it is pretty rough. It is pretty rough with the 2 damage sweeper. Sometimes it works out, but when it doesn't, it feels really bad. So when you're facing down like a big Warden or something, when you're facing down an Anthem effect that just buffs creatures out of range, it can get pretty problematic. But the good news is I think people are moving away from the enchantment Anthem type effects, specifically in Boros. So maybe you don't have to worry about that as much. And if a 2 damage sweeper is effective, then there's really no benefit to having Path of Peril, I would say, on average. So there's that. In fact, it would maybe be a benefit to have the 2 damage sweeper in some cases where you can kill some 3-drops maybe with the 2 damage sweeper. So it really depends on what the meta looks like specifically for Boros. But yeah, I don't know. I think this deck is just better than Sultai. You pretty much have the same tools. The only thing you're missing is just creature board presence. That is the main weakness for this over Sultai. Sultai having Slogurk is a massive advantage. The creature is just kind of crazy, and you do not have anything remotely close to that in Temur. So you're more so relying on your non-creature spells to stabilize you, and the green virtues, power, and value to try to have an explosive one-turn kill, essentially. So I would definitely place this just above Sultai Rec. It's probably towards the top of tier 2, so definitely like not at the top of A tier, but like very close, very close. Actually, I guess you could consider it the top of A tier because there's probably not going to be too many other decks here. Anyways, I guess I should close the A tier off probably, maybe. Alright, so I'm going to get another deck out the way that everybody knows, and it's Domain. I'm just going to talk about Domain because I want to, and Domain is ridiculous. The deck is just kind of nonsense. It has everything. It has good creatures, it has good reach, it has lifelink, it has flying, it has vigilance, it has go wide cards with the 3/3s, it has ramp, obviously it has a ramp. It has counters to counter magic, Cavern of Souls. It is such a it has card draw in Beanstalk, it has good sweepers. It is just an all-round all-star. Like it's absolutely insane. And it pretty much has the tools in the sideboard to, have tech cards against everything. Like you can have against control decks, you can play Tidebinder. You can play Jace even against control. Against aggro, you can play Lockdown. You have pretty much, you can play Graveyard Hate. You have access to everything. There is no major weakness. There's no like clear weakness to ramp, except that it has to line up spells in a certain way. At least it has to line up the ramp spells to get started, basically. Or at least, at the very least, find the battle that ramps, I would say. But when it finds the combination of like, turn 3 ramp with the 4/4 into battle, and it just gets out of hand. So they have explosive draws, but they also have like powerful draws that don't require combination of specific spells, like just playing the battle on turn 4 and like maybe removing something on turn 3. It has recovery effects with the sweepers. It's just it's kind of nonsense. Like the deck is just so powerful, and I think without Cavern of Souls, you might see this drop a tier potentially. But as it stands, with the Cavern being such a massive power increase and allowing it to basically care much less about counter spells in general, the deck is just kind of nonsense. And I would definitely consider Domain to be better than Boros in this metagame. I think it has pretty much everything. The only clear weakness, actually, it's pretty close. Again, like this is what I like about this meta, is I think decks are pretty close together because they have their strengths and weaknesses, right? Like Domain is a deck that is kind of vulnerable. I say kind of because Atraxas degenerate sometimes. But the combo decks have a clear line of attack into Domain because they're usually not playing counter magic in the main deck. If you get started before they do, before they gain too much life, for specifically Temur World Soul, sometimes they gain too much life. It's a lot easier for Sultai Rec to beat Domain because they're relying on like some kind of mill plan usually with the Jace. And Conspiracy is the same way. So specifically for World Soul, it can be like kind of even / difficult sometimes. It depends if they get started too early because you don't have access to spot removal. For these two, it's a lot easier. So Domain definitely still vulnerable. It's not a complete dominance from Domain, right? It can still lose to Boros as well, but the key factor for Domain is just the consistency is kind of ridiculous. And specifically a card like Archangel is absolute nonsense in that deck. It's just so absurd. A card like Archangel is pretty much the perfect glue for, answers to creatures, flipping your battle, direct damage to your face, dealing with planeswalkers. It's also a 3/4 body. It blocks really well. Like the card is just absolute nonsense in that deck. And I think that's what puts it above Boros for me, is that I think Domain, if they have the right sideboard plan, is going to be in a reasonable spot against Boros because the lifelink is crazy, right? But still, both can win in different... It's the play draw dependent. It's like very draw dependent. I think they're... Like Boros is not that consistent sometimes. If they don't find the most optimal start, Domain will just kind of stabilize in the mid game and just play a lifelinker and you're out the game. You're just kind of out. But in the general scale of the meta, I think Domain is just so hard to deal with because most decks are trying to play blue counter magic to deal with like other combo decks, but you can just bypass that with the Cavern. You have the Beanstalk card draw that just is hard to deal with in general for most decks, and mostly the sweepers. But again, there are some weaknesses here. It is weak to decks that are trying, like Blue-White Reanimate, I think is pretty good against this, and Bant Toxic. So tempo decks that have very high pressure but have counter magic, and they don't want to counter your creatures, they want to counter your sweepers, that's where Domain might struggle. But then, they still have cards like, specifically for these two, they don't really care about Archangel. So that's not really a point, but if the deck's game plan is to counter your sweepers, then Domain struggles. So honestly, these are like pretty interchangeable. I don't know. It's just, I think Domain is just, the Cavern of Souls, just, I guess both can use Cavern of Souls. I don't know. It's hard for me to say which one is actually better. I just put Domain higher because I think the power level is just like it's not like you can just sweep Domain like Boros. Sometimes you just play lockdown turn 3 and just kind of lose. There's no like just you win against ramp. Against Boros there is a you win, but against ramp it's like they can draw this. It's so rough. The you win only comes from specific decks that have counter magic and a ton of pressure to represent early on. But yeah, we'll leave it like this for now. And I'm going to talk about the deck that I mentioned anyways, since we're talking about it. I think Bant Toxic is super good. I think Bant Toxic is really good. It is a deck that doesn't care about much of what you're doing. It is a deck with counter magic. It is a deck with very good early game, but it does have weaknesses, just like every other deck in Standard. I feel like every deck kind of checks another deck in this meta, or like multiple other decks. That's why the meta is pretty wide, is that you're always going to have a weakness. And Bant Toxic's weakness is that it is absolutely horrendous against Boros. Like it is very bad against Boros, I think. No sweepers. You can't sweep because you're also playing creatures. Very like low board presence early game. This is the type of deck that takes advantage of a slow control / mid-rangey game plan. Yeah, control is not like super good for you either. It's mostly like this deck is really good against domain, basically. Domain or like combo decks sometimes, depending on the amount of counter magic you play, right? Because if you counter their like most combo decks except for conspiracy combo can just kill you. But the other decks still have to set up somewhat. So if you get started early, you can kind of represent enough pressure, as long as you have a counter spell at some point, to just counter like one of their attempts to, get started in their combination. You're gonna make a spot. You're gonna close out the game so fast. Like even specifically conspiracy combo, if you manage to counter their turn 4 combination and they don't have a follow up, you might be able to kill them like on turn 5 potentially. The Rot Priest is a card that sometimes does things that are just absolutely absurd. You can kill your opponent from so far away with multiple Rot Priests and like a March or something. So it has that X factor as well. Like it's a deck that has the X factor. I just think it's a deck that is kind of weak against very aggressive strategies, because it doesn't have access to that much defense. It's a deck that is low in stats overall. It's a deck that is trying to disrupt somewhat. It has pretty bad mana. It has like medium mana because it has to play cards like Morex and the Phyrexian land, the land that taps for Phyrexian mana, or not Phyrexian mana, but taps for mana for your Phyrexian creatures. So it's a pretty fragile deck when you attack it with creatures, basically. But if you're trying to attack it in any other direction, or if your game plan is relatively slow, this deck has a very clear line of attack, and it's very, very effective and can win without board presence when they're close to, like when they started putting poison stacks on you. When you already have poison stacks, they can close out the game without relying on creatures. I think that's very, very powerful in a metagame where, sweepers are valuable. Sweepers are very valuable because of decks like Boros. So being able to have some kind of game plan that indirectly kills your opponent is very strong, on top of representing early board presence. So Bant Toxic, definitely towards the top of A tier, aka tier 2. All right, we're almost there, and we're going to talk about, I guess, Esper, kind of a remnant of the previous metagames. And I think Esper is fine. And Esper mostly is kept in check. Here's the thing, is that this Boros deck is so popular and so good that it is keeping a lot of decks in check, as I mentioned, like Bant Toxic and a lot of other like kind of dirtly strategies. And Esper is not an exception. Esper is definitely kept in check by Boros. It is super rough when you're trying to develop kind of a slow-ish mid-range game plan. It does have counter magic. It does have removal. It can play sweepers, but usually it's like, Lockdown is not like super good. It plays Wedding Announcement, which is not that great against Boros. Everything is kind of slow to develop. It doesn't really have a clear kind of stop point. Like, it doesn't have a wall that can put against Boros where it's like, you're done. Even Rafine requires you to attack to get the benefit from it. And Boros likes you attacking into them 100%. And it is very rough to deal with a Boros player when you're on the draw as an Esper mid-range deck, because your answers are weaker than a control deck and your tempo is slower than an aggro deck. So it's kind of like you can't really compete with them on speed, and your controlling elements are just not as effective as if you were playing just a general control deck. So you're kind of in the middle, and that is not great. That is really not great. So I don't value Esper that high. Now, it is still good, and the reason it's good, and it's definitely better than Dimir tempo if you compare directly, because it has the same elements as Dimir, but has a little bit of trickiness added to it with the white. The Rafine is very powerful. Wandering Emperor is very powerful. Virtue is very powerful. And I think those 3 elements are the main things. Denic is also very good. So it has, the white adds enough kind of versatility that Dimir Tempo doesn't have, while still keeping kind of that strategy in mind where you have access to that blue potentially for disruption, and the blue is absolutely important. Very important in this meta. So the value of Esper is still very high, I think, because it's pretty effective into like the combo decks, pretty effective into domain. It's kind of like an all-rounder basically with the counter magic on top of that. So it's a good deck. It's just not S tier because of Boros basically. And also I think it isn't like super good against ramp either. So I think Esper is not like the best deck to face like these two, I think. Like domain's probably like close to 50-50, I would say. It depends like play draw. It depends like what you draw, really. It depends how the Esper deck is constructed. There are many different lists of Esper. Like you can play like Erdtime maybe. That's a little better against domain. But most of the time I think they have to play a little bit more defensive because they have to be afraid of Boros convoke, and it's everywhere. So yeah, we're talking about specifically arena, I would say. When I'm making like the final decisions, it's mostly about like how good is the deck on arena, basically. So Esper gonna be around here, I would say. It's still a very good deck, but it's not quite S tier. Definitely not. Actually, no, it's definitely not S tier, I would say. Now, is it better than anything else that's in this tier? Yeah. I think this is interesting. I think it's close to being worse than Bant Toxic. But the fact that you can play sweepers in the sideboard, like you can play lockdown in the sideboard, while Bant Toxic cannot, means that your weakness of Boros Convoke can be shored up a little bit, whereas I think Bant, you're just kind of screwed. I could be wrong though. Maybe if you play the Thrall in Bant, if you play like 4 Thrall maybe that just puts a very large kind of wall in front of Boros where they slow down a lot, potentially. I actually don't know. This is something that I would have to think about a little bit more. I do think Bant Toxic is better into domain and into most combo decks because theoretically they're playing like the same amount of counter spells, and this just gets the job done a lot easier because this has to deal damage, right? So actually, I will revise this. I think Bant Toxic is worse against Boros than Esper is, but I think Bant Toxic is better against the more combo-oriented decks than Esper is. So I think I'm going to put more value on that than whatever mid-range things that Esper is doing. It's kind of like too middle of the road. It's not like super overpowering, whereas Bant Toxic has some overpowering elements to it. This is a little bit more fair in its game plan, I think. Even though it's still doing like pretty high tier things, right? Like Raffine is a ridiculous card, Wandering Emperor, Wedding Announcement, stuff like that. So I'm going to orient it like this. All right, I'm going to leave Blue-White Control for last. I'm going to talk about Mono Red. Mono Red is super good. Mono Red is insane. It is a deck that you can never count out, kind of like Boros, and that's the power of aggro decks, that they sense weakness and you're dead. It's really difficult. Sometimes the thing is, aggro decks they have the duality to them where you shut them down completely, or you're in a spot where you're always worried about death, or they just kill you. Like there's no real middle ground, I think. Usually you either know you won or you're dead. And the good thing about aggro decks in this meta, and I guess in Magic in general, is that they take advantage of the fundamental issue of play draw extremely well. And they do that because the cards that are designed for the aggro decks, like Kumano, for example, are extremely difficult to deal with when they're played on the play. Because it just creates like a stat difference, it creates like a damage vacuum. Like it's mostly the stats that it represents. Like Kumano potentially buffing your 2-drop from a 2/2 to a 3/3 is kind of ridiculous. And then also having the 2/2 after that, but also like pinging on turn 1, so you also have that damage. So the pace of play is so fast from Mono Red. It's not equivalent to Boros, not quite, which is why I'm gonna put it here. But I guess I might as well just put it here, and I'll keep talking about it. So it's not quite the explosive power that Boros can present, but it is a different direction. So what's the main difference here between Mono Red and Boros, and why I think potentially Boros is better? Mono Red has its strengths when it comes to dealing with sweepers, and most people are playing a lot of sweepers because Boros is so good, and Mono Red is pretty good at kind of dodging them a little bit better. And the game plan for Mono Red is a little bit more effective against like very sweeper oriented decks that are trying to like deal with specifically, wide board states. Because everything has haste, if your opponent is spending like a lot of mana into a single spell to like remove the whole board, you can just play a bunch of haste creatures. Like everything in your deck contributes towards your opponent losing life, basically. So they'll never be safe by just answering, creature, sweeping. They have to somehow gain life, basically, to put you in a position where you might struggle. They have to remove your stuff and also gain life. So that's the tricky part when it comes to Mono Red, and when it comes to finding answers for Mono Red, which is why Mono Red is in a decent spot right now, or a very good spot, because I'm putting it in S tier, is because most people are more so tailoring their deck towards Boros, where, Lifelink is still effective against Boros, but Lifelink is way more effective against Mono Red. So people are like trying to stabilize their board with sweepers, with lockdown, stuff like that. And Mono Red doesn't get hit by it as much as Boros does. And your life total will never be safe. Whereas against Boros, you can kind of take a breather when they have no board, basically. Against Mono Red, that is not the case. Now that has its upsides and downsides, of course, because we have Temur World Soul, we have Sultai Rec, we have Esper that has Dennick potentially. Any form of lifelink unanswered is going to be a huge problem for Mono Red, whereas Boros, it's kind of like, it's not the total end of the world. They can still kind of bypass that with a huge swing. Mono Red, you're kind of in trouble if that lifelinker swings or sticks around. So there's that, but Mono Red still has removal, so it's not like a huge deal. But the bigger problem is that Temur World Soul and Sultai Rec, if they manage to stabilize their board, all those lands that gain life, that's going to add up. And that's going to create a huge padding to the opposing life total, right? So Mono Red's going to struggle to close out the game against decks that have life gain that is not directly tied to creatures, potentially, or like in a way, right? But sometimes there is benefit to being tied to creatures. So, like, for example, if Domain slams Attracts, the game is just over for Mono Red. So you can say goodbye pretty much, unless you have specifically Witchstalker's Frenzy plus like 2 damage. So that's pretty unlikely at that point in the game. But lifelink is absolutely devastating for Mono Red. Not to say that Atraxa would not win the game against Boros. It probably still will, but maybe they have a huge case, like they could, if they have seven creatures, they play the case. Atraxa's that wishful thinking, but that's why Domain is so good. It's like Atraxa is such a wall. It's absolutely shuts down the game in most situations. And since you have so many other stabilizing elements in Domain, like the freaking Archangel that is absolutely insane against Mono Red, that's another huge problem, right? Whereas Archangel is good against Boros, but you still leave them with a lot of creatures potentially attacking. Mono Red is like, you kill the creature, you have 3-4 life linker, you gained 4 life, it's completely over. Like most of the time, there's no coming back from that, unless nothing else happened to their board and they still have like 3 creatures, but that's like probably not happening with Bant with so many ways to remove stuff. But either way, Mono Red is good. It takes advantage of people playing greedier decks. It takes advantage of specific control decks with the Forge and stuff. Like it has access to so much. It has access to so much, and it's gaining more and more, right? The case is definitely a really good card, and specifically the Forge, I think, is just devastating for specifically blue-white control. But I guess I kind of made it obvious by leaving a spot here, but I think this is just at the top. I don't know. Blue-white control is ridiculous. If you build your deck to kind of target a portion of the meta, you can do that extremely effectively while not losing much effectiveness against the rest of the meta. So, for example, if you play like for Lockdown, for freaking March, for, I don't know, whatever, Soul Sunfall, you can just annihilate Boros. Like, you can take that out of the picture pretty much. You can play Thrall as well. Like, there are a lot of tech cards that you can add, kind of like where Domain has access to everything in the sideboard. Blue-white control, by that same token, also has everything in the sideboard. And they're able to play a game plan in their main deck that almost no other deck can do. And that's the, 4 lockdown game plan with like, Wandering Emperors with a bunch of Sunfall. And that takes care of a lot of decks already. It takes care, well, specifically a large portion of the meta being Boros Convoke. It's very effective against that. It's very effective against Bant Toxic. Very effective against any mid-range deck whatsoever, because those mid-range decks are going to play creatures, Sunfall Rex creatures. Even Lockdown is very effective against mid-range decks these days because they're playing cheap creatures, they're playing tokens specifically. So even a card like Lockdown is very effective at hitting, something from your opponent, no matter what they're playing. Even a deck like Temur World Soul, you can hit the 1/3. Same thing for Sultai Records, same thing, you can still hit the 1/3. And another benefit to control is just the fact that you are able to answer everything. And whether that be through counter magic or just straight removal. So every card you're drawing is an answer, basically. Unlike other decks that might have those answers, but they also have their own board presence, you don't have that. So you don't have to worry as much about other people playing answers to your cards, because the only answers they could possibly have are going to be only counterspell, right? So all their removal spells, all their interactive spells, all their sweepers, that's going to be dead. So you're removing that out of the equation. So you're very effective against Boros because of the way that the deck is built. You're very effective against mono red, and you're very effective against other decks that are trying to answer these two decks, for example, or even other decks that go wide. So every deck that's playing a sweeper automatically loses a little bit of power against blue-white control, right? But blue-white control, they have so much card draw that it doesn't matter as much for them that they have access to like a bunch of like potential dead cards. And even, again, as I mentioned, they won't necessarily be dead. You'll hit a Sunfall at some point against Domain. You'll hit a Sunfall eventually against Esper. You'll hit a Sunfall against any deck, really. Even a Lockdown, as I said. So like those cards that blue-white is playing will never be dead. Whereas the same Sunfall in a Domain deck will not be effective at all. Even a card like Binding is not that effective against blue-white. So every form of removal is just not as effective. So you're basically taking out a lot of your opponent's deck or effectiveness from their main deck. And that is very powerful. There's only one deck that can do that, and it's blue-white, because they're just playing a totally different strategy where they have absolutely nothing that you can interact with efficiently. Another thing is that in blue-white control, there is a card called Jace. And Jace is a planeswalker that can draw you cards, but also acts as a win condition. And that win condition is going to be milling your opponent out. So why is that good? Because we have some combo decks that are milling themselves, potentially. So that's number one. So you can just mill them out more easily than other decks. And specifically against Domain, a deck that wants to go long because they have to go long. They don't have a clear way to finish you off in Domain. They have to do it through damage. That means you can extend the game through sweepers, through removal, and eventually they'll get low enough on cards where you just mill them out with Jace. So essentially it's a stall game. So Jace giving you access to that win condition against slower decks that can theoretically beat you. If you didn't have it, for example, maybe they would beat you at some point, right? Because you would have to let something through eventually. Because their rate of card draw, like they're going to be resolving Atraxa, essentially. Domain is going to resolve Atraxa. These decks have a lot of card draw. So eventually they would probably find an opportunity to beat you, but you can speed up the game in specific positions with Jace to just close it out, right? So they'll probably never have the opportunity to totally come back into the game, or not come back. Usually you're dead by the time they resolve their combo. In this case, well, not so much Sultai. I guess Sultai has Jace as well. But yeah, so there's Jace. That is a huge factor in why I think blue-white is good. And then in general, there's also the fact that blue-white plays land destruction while also playing very powerful lands like Mirrex. So land destruction will shut off your opponent's potential creature lands, so you don't have to worry about that as much. It can shut down Cavern of Souls as well, so there's some way to like kind of weave in counter magic eventually. It can shut down your opponent's Mirrexes as well, which is going to be devastating to control. So it has its bases covered in ways that you might be able to attack it, specifically with Mirrex, for example. And the fact that everything is an answer, and the fact that everything is a powerful answer in this deck, means that your opponent's going to have trouble closing out the game. Whether they want to, resolve a combo, you can just counter that, or whether they want to attack you with creatures, sweep, direct damage, counter that. You can gain life. You can set up your own board presence with the Sunfall token, the Wandering Emperor, and it is just kind of devastating for your opponent to deal with so many answers, so much card draw, so many effective sweepers. Like they're the best sweepers you can possibly have in the format. And the sideboard, again, the key point I think is the sideboard, is that the sideboard has everything pretty much. You have the graveyard hate that you need for the combo decks. You have more counter magic. You have more counter spells, specifically Tidebinder, very effective. You potentially have more answers to aggro. There's just everything. You can transform your deck into the most specialized version that it has to be in different matchups. And your sideboard might not be perfect, so you might realize like, okay, I'm missing something as Boros. You can add that. Like there's all the tools are there. Tools are there. It's just your choice as to whether you want to tailor your deck more towards this deck or towards that deck. But with blue-white control, the win will always be in sight, basically. You will always have a way to potentially come back into a game. The answers are there. It's just a matter of whether or not you can draw them. And I just do not think there's a single deck that is so effective against control. Okay, actually, I take that back. There is one deck. It's probably Bant Toxic. But even that deck, it's probably Bant Toxic, yeah. Okay, there is like one. When I say only good matchups, I mean like the most popular matchups are good. Like maybe you face like Bant Toxic is not popular, basically. Maybe if it becomes popular, that could be a different story. But the no bad matchups applies to the most popular decks, so the vast majority of the meta. I would say like 90%, 95% maybe of the metagame. Those matchups are either even or favored. In fact, I would say most of them, if you build your deck correctly, are going to be favored. So that's what I call a winning matchup is something that is more than 50-50, basically, for you, in your favor. But yeah, either way, that's just my view on the metagame. It could be correct. It could not be correct. I don't play tournaments anymore, so there's that. So tournament metagame is different. Also, keep that in mind. What I'm rating here is just my experience on Arena and how I view Arena. And Arena is definitely a different playstyle, different metagame than tournaments. So the value of consistency is very high on Arena. Something like a consistent deck is just better because you want to climb. You want to win the most possible games against the widest variety of matchups possible. And I think Blue-White is the best at doing that because it has answers for just about everything. Whereas some decks might not have answers for specific things. Having counter magic is a huge part. And yeah, I think Blue-White Control is the most consistent deck, consistently good deck in the widest variety of matchups. Tournaments are a little bit different, as I mentioned in a different video as well, where the metagame is a little bit more focused, a little bit more targeted. People are bringing what they think are the best decks and decks that potentially counter those. You can expect a lot more from a tournament than you can on Arena. On Arena, it's kind of like, oh, here's this new deck I haven't seen in a while, or here's like a black-green mid-range player that probably shouldn't be playing the deck because the deck sucks. This might be the only deck with less than 50% win percentage. And maybe Mono Blue. I will say that it's possible that Mono Blue is supposed to be here, but I don't know. I do know for sure that this is the worst deck that I'm rating. That's for sure. After testing it more, I have no doubts. But yeah, hope you guys enjoyed this video. If you did, click the like button, and of course, subscribe to my channel if you want to see more. You can check out my second channel where I play roguelikes. Link in the description. Thank you for watching till the end, and I'll see you in the next one.